Have you ever driven alone at night and felt like you weren't alone? Imagine encountering a woman in white on the highway, a shadow in your truck, or a town where time stands still. Today, I bring you 3 stories that will make you think twice before hitting the road again. My grandfather, Arthur, used to say that the road is a living being, with its own rules and whims. He drove his truck across the United States from coast to coast for 50 years, and his stories were my favorites. All except one. The one about the woman in white on Route 66, a winding, poorly lit stretch between St. Louis and Chicago. The rule was simple, burned into my mind since childhood. Never, under any circumstances, stop for the woman in the white dress hitchhiking on that specific part of the highway. He never explained why, just shook his head, his dark eyes losing a bit of their light. He died of natural causes, they said, but I always noticed a shadow in his gaze in his later years, a caution that bordered on dread. I found his old logbook, bound in worn leather, when I inherited his truck. The first pages were ordinary notes, fuel, tolls, cargo. But in the middle of the book, the entries changed. There were scattered reports, dated from decades ago, about other truckers. A man named Jack, from Tulsa, who stopped for a distressed woman and his truck was found empty, engine still running. Another, named Thomas, from Springfield, who reported on the CB radio seeing a pale woman with a child before his signal vanished forever. My grandfather was not a superstitious man, but those pages were filled with a feverish urgency, a warning repeated to exhaustion. He did not make it up. He was documenting a real danger. Years passed, and I became the family trucker, traveling the same roads Arthur did. Route 66 was my old acquaintance, and whenever I passed the section he mentioned, a chill ran down my spine. Until that Tuesday night, a storm system unleashed its fury over Illinois with biblical rage. The rain fell in dense, opaque curtains, reducing visibility to a few meters. The winds rocked the truck with violent jolts. I had reduced my speed to a cautious crawl, my eyes burning with concentration, trying to discern the blackened lane amidst the aquatic chaos. Then I saw her. It was not a shadow, not a trick of the imagination. She was there, standing on the shoulder, motionless as a statue. A simple white dress that seemed not at all wet, clinging to her slender body. Her long dark hair fell over her shoulders, and her face was of a cadaverous pallor. She did not wave, made no gesture. She just stared into the cab of my truck with an intensity that pierced through me, her eyes dark like 2 bottomless pits. And beside her, holding her hand, was a little girl. My heart stopped. The girl wore a pink pajama, the kind with little animal prints, identical to what my daughter Laura had worn the night before. And the face, even at a distance and through the veil of rain, was my Laura's face. The same chin curve, the same eye shape, the same rebellious curls. The child looked at me and smiled, a wide, unnatural smile that did not reach her eyes, which were completely black, like the woman's, like 2 ink stains on the white of her pale face. An ice that was not from the storm spread through my veins. I stomped on the accelerator, the engine roared, and the truck lurched forward, leaving the 2 figures behind. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. It was impossible. Laura was at our home in Joplin, over 300 miles away, safe with her mother. I had tucked her into bed before leaving for this trip. Logic screamed in my head, but the image of that child, a perfect double of my daughter, was burned into my retina. The most terrifying explanation was the only one that fit. That thing, whatever it was, had taken the image of the person I loved most in this world. I had barely recovered from the initial shock when a curve approached, and there they were, in the same relative spot on the shoulder, in the same posture. The woman in white and the little Laura. Just, they were closer to the road. I did not see them move, did not see them walk. They had simply materialized in that new location, as if the space between us did not exist. The girl still smiled her empty smile, her black eyes fixed on me. Nausea rose in my throat. I accelerated again, the truck gaining speed dangerously on the slippery road. Every curve, every straightaway, was agony. And each time, they reappeared. The third time, they were at the edge of the asphalt, the woman's feet almost touching the lane. The fourth time, they seemed mere feet from the front bumper. The distance was shortening. Their method of pursuit was an affront to the laws of physics, a terror that eroded my sanity. I was not being followed, I was being intercepted. That was when the CB radio, which until then had only emitted the white noise of static and fragments of other drivers' conversations, changed. A low, distant whisper cut through the interference. It was Laura's voice. "Daddy." The sound was faint, full of static, but unmistakably hers. "Daddy, I'm scared. It's dark here." My blood turned to ice. The voice continued, a little clearer, more urgent. "Daddy, why won't you stop? I'm cold. She promised me you would come get me." I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, desperately searching for the next apparition. The voice on the radio became a soft, sobbing cry, the sound that broke my heart when she had a nightmare. "Please, Daddy, save me. She says if you don't stop, I have to stay with her forever." The comprehension hit me like a physical blow. This was not just a lost soul haunting the road. It was a predatory entity, a hunter. She did not just want a ride, a moment of attention. She wanted a life. And to free herself, to gain a new companion for her eternal vigil, she needed to offer an exchange. She had my daughter's image, my daughter's voice, and she used my deepest love as bait. Have you ever felt your own protective instinct turn against you? Have you ever realized that the greatest danger to someone you love might be your own attempt to save them? For a moment, a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity, I considered the possibility. What if it was her? What if, by some miracle or curse, my Laura was really there, on that dark, wet road? The idea was insane, but love is a form of insanity, and panic its fuel. I shook my head violently, banishing the thought. It was a trap. Stopping would be signing my real daughter's death warrant. I pressed the accelerator so hard my fingers ached. The truck, a frightened steel horse, shot forward. At the next curve, they were there, no longer on the shoulder, but in the middle of my lane. The woman in white, with her impassive expression, and the child, with her nightmare smile and empty eyes. I did not slow down. I closed my eyes for a millisecond and steered the vehicle to the side, passing them with a sudden gust of wind that shook the truck. When I dared to look in the rear-view mirror, the road was empty. The rain began to ease, turning into a fine drizzle. The CB radio emitted one last whisper, this time with the woman's voice, a thing dry and lifeless like dead leaves being dragged on asphalt. "Another day, another truck. He will learn." The voice vanished, replaced by silence. I drove to the next gas station, my body shaking uncontrollably. I parked among other trucks, under the harsh, safe light of the floodlights. I called home on my cell phone, my hands still trembling. My wife answered, her voice thick with sleep. I asked to speak to Laura. I heard little footsteps, and then my daughter's voice, real, warm, and full of life, came on the phone. "Hi, Daddy. Did you get there okay?" I broke down, sobbing with relief and a terror that had not yet left me. She was safe. But the curse was not over. I had disobeyed the primary rule. I had looked. I had allowed her to see what mattered most to me. And as I ended the call, promising my daughter I would see her in 2 days, an image invaded my mind. The image of the woman in white, not on the road, but standing across the street from my house, holding hands with a small figure in a pink dress. It was just a flash, a projection of my fear, I told myself. But the seed was planted. The road is a living being, and its roots now stretch to my home. She knew where I lived. She knew where my Laura lived. The next storm, the next dark night, I would not be on the road to intercept her. The pursuit had only begun, and the final target was no longer me. The night was particularly dark on I-95, a dense blackness that swallowed my truck's headlights as if they were insignificant. I was coming from New York, heading to Miami, a long and lonely haul, like so many others. Fatigue was beginning to settle into my bones, a familiar weight after hours on the road. I decided to stop at an abandoned gas station I knew, a place that always offered me a moment of peace for a quick coffee before continuing my journey. I parked in the dark area, between the broken fuel pumps and the main building with its shattered windows. The silence was absolute, broken only by the cooling engine. I got out, prepared my coffee in an old thermos, and returned to the truck, eager to get back on the road. As soon as I entered the cab and closed the door, a strange feeling washed over me, as if the air inside the vehicle had become heavier. I placed the coffee cup in the holder and started the engine, my eyes scanning the desolate surroundings in the rear-view mirror. That's when I saw, in the corner of my vision, a figure sitting in the passenger seat. My heart leaped, but my rational mind quickly attributed it to fatigue, a shadow cast by the dim light. I took a deep breath and shifted into gear, pulling out of the station and onto the highway. But the figure did not disappear. It remained there, motionless, a dark and indistinct silhouette. I looked directly at it and realized it was not an illusion. It was a shadow, a human form sitting calmly, with its arms resting on its lap. Its outline was humanoid, but its details were blurred, as if seen through a dirty window. And most terrifyingly, its face was a smudge without features, a blurred area where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. A chill ran down my spine, and my hands sweated on the wheel. I tried to convince myself it was a product of exhaustion, that if I blinked hard or concentrated, it would vanish. But it remained. And then, as if responding to my thoughts, the figure moved its right arm in sync with mine when I changed gears. It was a perfect imitation, but delayed by a fraction of a second, like a visual echo. Fear began to grow within me, a coldness spreading from my chest to my extremities. The road ahead was a dark tunnel, with only my headlights cutting through the blackness. I looked at the shadow again, and this time, a low whisper filled the air inside the cab. They were not clear words, but distorted sounds, as if someone were speaking backwards. I thought about checking the GPS, and the whisper echoed SPG, an inverted, distorted version of my thought. This wasn't external. It came from inside my own head, but it emanated from that figure. The entity was studying me. In the following minutes, every movement I made was replicated. If I adjusted the rearview mirror, it raised its hand to its own ear in a similar gesture. If I scratched my chin, it did the same. It was like watching a perverse reflection in a broken mirror. The whispers became more frequent, always echoing my most intimate thoughts in reverse. I thought of my wife, Lucy, and the whisper hissed, "I Coel," making my blood run cold. It knew Lucy. It was invading my memories. Now, you might be listening to this and thinking how easy it would be to ignore, to attribute it to hallucinations, but I assure you, the presence was tangible, the air grew colder near it, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was as if my own mind was being drained out of me. Gradually, the figure began to change. Its facial features, once a formless smudge, began to define themselves. A line that could be a mouth appeared, and then the outline of eyes. They were my eyes, my mouth, forming on that dark mass. It was stealing my appearance, becoming a distorted version of me. Every memory it whispered, every mannerism it copied, brought it closer to my own image. I saw myself in that seat, but with an empty expression and eyes that reflected no light. Panic set in. I remembered stories I'd heard at truck stops about entities that feed on lonely travelers, and I realized I could not stop the truck. Whenever I slowed down, the shadow seemed to become more solid, more real. If I stopped completely, it might fully materialize. My only plan was to reach the next gas station, a place with movement and light, where perhaps this presence could not follow. I pressed the accelerator, maintaining a constant speed, but the road began to behave strangely. The mile markers seemed not to change, the curves repeated, as if I were in an infinite loop. I looked at the GPS, but the screen flickered with static, always showing my location on the same abandoned stretch. The road stretched out ahead, a ribbon of asphalt that led nowhere. The shadow beside me now had a frightening resemblance to me, its features almost complete, lacking only the vital spark. Its whispers became clearer, no longer inverted, but repeating my own words in my own voice, a hoarse whisper promising that I would soon be free. I knew what it wanted. It wasn't just imitating me, it wanted to replace me. It wanted to take my life, my identity, and drag me into the darkness of that abandoned station, where we would switch places forever. It wanted me to become the faceless shadow for the next traveler. Then, the climax arrived. My hands were trembling on the wheel, and I was struggling to maintain control, when the entity moved its arm and placed its hand on the steering wheel. Its hand was solid now, cold as marble, and it pulled the wheel to the side, forcing the truck into a sharp turn. I tried to resist, but my strength was fading, as if it were draining my life force. The truck was now heading back in the direction I had come from, towards the abandoned station. I looked at the shadow, and for the first time, it had a complete face, my face, but with completely black eyes and an expression of cruel triumph. It whispered in my voice that it was time to go home, to its place. The road seemed to bend, shortening the distance, and I could see the faint lights of the station ahead, like a beacon calling me to perdition. I knew that if we arrived there, it would be the end. My only hope was to break the spell before it was too late, but with every second, my thoughts became confused with its, and I no longer knew where I ended and it began. The truck accelerated towards the station, and I felt my consciousness slipping, as if being erased. The last thing I perceived was the figure beside me rising, ready to take control, while I became little more than a shadow, condemned to repeat this cycle eternally. I had always heard the older truckers talk about the witching hour, that period between 3:33 and 4:44 in the morning when the world seems to grow thin, when roads can take you to places that should not exist. I, Arthur, always thought they were just stories to scare rookies, road legends my grandfather, Albert, would tell to entertain himself during the long nights behind the wheel. I was a practical man, concerned with delivery deadlines and my daughter Isabella, waiting for me back home in Kansas City. But that night, everything changed. I was driving on Interstate 70, returning from a delivery in Victory, a load of steel destined for a factory in Plainfield. The sky was starry, the road deserted, and I relied on my GPS to guide me through the darkness. I glanced at the dashboard clock, 3:33 a.m., and remembered the stories. A chill ran down my neck, but I ignored it, attributing it to fatigue. My rational mind said it was just another night, but a primal instinct whispered for me to be careful. Suddenly, a thick, white fog descended upon the road like a veil, so fast I barely had time to react. I reduced my speed, my headlights cutting through the milky gloom, but visibility dropped to just a few meters. I looked at the GPS, and the screen flickered once, twice, before going dark completely. I reset the device, but it wouldn't turn on, as if the power had been sucked out. A feeling of panic began to form in my chest, but I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. I knew this road, I had traveled it dozens of times. But something was wrong. The fog seemed to guide me, and without the GPS, I instinctively followed an exit that appeared to my right, a secondary road I didn't remember seeing on the map. The signs were old and corroded, barely legible, with the name St. Thomas of the Pumpkins, a place I had never heard of. The road was dirt, with potholes that made the truck sway violently. The trees around us were twisted and dark, leafless, like skeletons emerging from the ground. After a few minutes, the fog began to dissipate, and I entered the town. I immediately realized something was terribly wrong. It was a small inland town, with low houses and a central square, but there was no movement. Cars were parked on the street, some with their doors open, but their engines were cold, as if they had been there for years. And the people, oh God, the people were frozen in the middle of their actions. A woman in a yellow dress was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, a grocery bag suspended in the air, as if she had been walking and was petrified. A man near a pole had his hand raised, greeting someone who would never come. Their eyes were empty, lifeless, and there was no sound at all, except the muffled noise of my engine, as if we were inside a bubble. I parked the truck near the square, my heart pounding hard against my chest. I got out of the vehicle, my legs shaky, and walked over to the frozen man. I touched his arm, and it was cold and hard as marble. He didn't react, didn't breathe. He was like a perfect statue. The silence was oppressive, so dense I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. I looked around and saw that all the windows of the houses were dark, except for a few where shadows were moving. Tall, slender figures with disproportionate limbs, arms so long they almost touched the ground, watched from the windows. They had no defined features, just distorted human outlines, with small heads and eyes glowing like dots of charcoal. They were not hostile, made no threatening moves. They just watched with an intense and disturbing curiosity. I felt their gazes on me, as if they were studying me, learning about me. I ran back to the truck, locking the doors. My instinct screamed for me to get out of there immediately. I started the engine, and the gruff sound seemed to echo through the silent town, attracting attention. The figures began to move, emerging from the shadows of the houses, gliding smoothly toward the truck. They didn't walk, they seemed to float, their movements fluid and unnatural. Their long arms swayed slightly, and I could see their hands had thin, articulated fingers. I looked at the clock on the dashboard, 4:15 a.m. I remembered the stories, that I needed to leave before the sun rose in this place. I looked for a clock in the town, and saw one on the church tower, stopped at 4:30, but the hands weren't moving. Then I realized that all the visible clocks, in shops in the square, showed the same time, 4:30, as if time had stopped at that exact moment. But something told me that when the sun of this dimension rose, time would start again, and I would be trapped there forever, like those frozen people. You might be listening to this and thinking it's easy to judge, that I should have avoided the exit, but in that darkness, with the fog and the dead GPS, there was no choice. Fear is a treacherous advisor, and the line between reality and madness is thinner than we imagine. The figures were now crowding around the truck, their slender forms blocking the street. They didn't touch the vehicle, they just watched with that unsettling curiosity. One of them approached the windshield, its outline blurred against the glass, and I could see that its eyes weren't just dots, they were empty depths that sucked in the light. I felt an irresistible urge to look into them, but I averted my gaze, focusing on the road ahead. I needed to find the way out. I remembered that in the legend, the exit is always where you least expect it, often at the point opposite the entrance. I came in on the main road, so maybe the exit was at the end of town. I started driving slowly, honking to shoo the figures away, but the sound of the horn was muffled, as if underwater. They moved away slowly, making way, but followed me with their fixed stares. The streets were a maze, all identical, with symmetrical houses and people frozen in everyday poses. I passed a school where children were frozen in the playground, their games interrupted forever. I passed a cafe where a waiter was frozen pouring coffee into a cup. Each scene was a frightening portrait of suspended life. The dashboard clock read 4:40, and the sky began to lighten slightly, not with sunlight, but with a pale, sickly luminescence emanating from the horizon. The figures became more agitated, moving faster, their forms flickering. They began to reach out toward the truck, as if they wanted to touch it, to feel the metal. I accelerated, ignoring the potholes in the street, the truck shaking violently. I saw a sign ahead indicating exit, but the road seemed to close up. The figures crowded in front, forming a living barrier. I couldn't stop, not now. I pressed the accelerator, closing my eyes for an instant, and when I opened them, the truck was passing through them as if they were made of smoke. I felt an intense cold run through the cab, and heard low whispers, words in unknown languages, echoing in my mind. The town clock still read 4:30, but the dashboard clock now showed 4:43. I was running out of time. The light in the sky was growing stronger, and the shadows of the figures lengthened, becoming more defined. They were gaining substance, and I knew that if the sun rose, it would be too late. I spotted a dirt road to the left, unpaved, that seemed to lead out of town. I turned sharply, the wheels skidding on the gravel. The figures chased me, running now, their steps silent but fast. The truck entered the road, and ahead, I saw the fog returning, forming a sort of portal. The dashboard clock read 4:44. With one last effort, I entered the fog, and everything went white for a moment. When my vision cleared, I was back on Interstate 70. The GPS suddenly turned on, showing my familiar location. I looked back, and the secondary road had disappeared, replaced by dense vegetation. The sky was dark, and the clock now read 4:45 a.m., the real sun beginning to rise on the horizon. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the fear never left me. Since then, I never drive during the witching hour. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I think I see for a second the reflection of a slender figure behind me, its dark eyes curious, a reminder that some doors, once opened, never fully close.